All right. I began the study of language and the brain mostly because it's the most fascinating subject around, with the biggest problems. And of course, to look at its evolution is sort of the real challenge, the real a golden egg one searches for. The challenge for me as a young student was that there was really no place I could go where people were actually studying brains to understand how they evolved. There were a lot of people studying how big brains were and things like that, but there was not a lot of neuroscience when I began as a young student directed in that particular enterprise. And so that became a challenge for me, and I did all that I could to study both the linguistic side of things, the communication side, but also the neuroanatomical side of these questions. And it turns out that, of course, the study of brains and the study of language can't be done in one field. It really requires that you sort of dabble in many fields, become perhaps a master of none. The danger, of course, is then you get a superficial picture, but you get a superficial picture if you're just in one area as well. So I have tried throughout my career to sort of walk that middle ground and ask the question, what do I need to know to answer these questions? So most of my work was in the neurosciences. I began by trying to adapt at the time in the early 80s some of the new technologies for tracing connections in brains. Thought that that might be a way to go at the question. And in fact, some of my early work traced the connections in monkey brains that corresponded to the language connections in human brains. And that's what really got me on that path, partly because a surprise came of that work. And the surprise was that all the predictions about what the connections would be like in human brains, we suspected would be quite different in monkey brains, and we learned something about those differences. The surprise was that, as far as we could tell, the plan was the same plan. The way these areas were connected, even areas that we identified as language areas or the correspondent areas in monkeys, had the same kinds of connections. And it was a baffling finding. And in fact, the more we got new data about human brains, the more we found that the data we had picked up on monkey brains and how they were organized actually predicted the connections and the functionality of these language areas and how they were distributed. So a brain that didn't do anything like human brains do in terms of communication and vocalization and so on, nevertheless seemed to have the same organization. And it was one of the first big turning points, I think, in my work, in realizing that somehow we would have to explain how the same kind of computer, so to speak, and I think computer's a bad metaphor, but it's the one we have, how the same kind of device was running a very different kind of software, so to speak, how it could be, how the tweaks in that system might have worked. To study that, I went off in a number of directions, more mapping of brain areas in primates, trying to understand their links to humans, but also much more comparative work and also developmental work. And I've spent a good deal of the last decade studying how brains develop, because of course brains don't evolve from adult stage to adult stage. What happens is embryology changes over the course of evolution, and that changes the resultant. And that area is also full of surprises as we pursued it forward in these last couple of decades. Most surprisingly is that brains are not, hard to say this, but brains are not designed the way we would design any machine. And they're not built the way we would build a machine. We don't take the parts and put them together to build a whole. In fact, what happens is just the other way around. The whole starts out, it's just undifferentiated. The parts aren't distinguished from each other. And they become more and more different from each other. The system becomes more and more complicated. The problem is the process is very indirect. It's not like building something from a plan. It's a very indirect process. And it became very clear that this process is very much what we would call today self-organization. That is, a lot of the information that goes into building brains is not actually there in the genes. It's sort of cooked up or whipped up on the fly as brains develop. And so if one's to explain how a very complicated organ like the brain actually evolved, changed its function to be able to do something like language, one has to understand it through this very complicated prism of self-organization and a kind of mini evolution process that goes on as brains develop, in which cells compete with each other for nutrients, essentially. Some of them persist and some of them don't. Some lineages go on to produce vast structures in the brain. Other lineages get eliminated as we develop, just in some way like evolution. And like evolution, it's a way of creating information on the fly, sort of sampling the world around you, in this case the body, as well as the external world, and adjusting yourself to it. And in some ways, the brain has that character too. And what the complication of all of this is, it's made me realize that the problem of language is a problem that's not going to be ultimately solved by a kind of engineering model, by a kind of reverse engineering. We're going to have to think like, in a sense, biology thinks, like embryology works, in this kind of self-organizing, self-evolving, like logic, to get back at what actually causes things to occur and develop in complex ways. It's even, I think, the case with language itself. That is, I think language itself, as it's passed from generation to generation, has a kind of self-organizing and evolution-like character to it. That is also part of where the structure comes from, where it picks it up on the fly, so to speak. And we have to work that into our stories. And that is really the impetus for the book I wrote. The Symbolic Species captures the essence of that idea in its subtitle, The Coevolution of Language in the Brain. My argument ultimately was that language itself was part of the process that was responsible for the evolution of the brain. And I mean that in the following sense. Imagine the evolution of beavers. Beavers are aquatic animals today, but they're aquatic because of what beavers in the past have done. That is, beavers have created their own world to some extent. They've created an aquatic world by building dams and blocking up streams and turning them into small lakes. Beavers' bodies have evolved in adaptation to the world that beavers created. It's a kind of complex ratcheting effect in which what you do changes the environment that produces the selection on your body. Now, I think language is, in a sense, our beaver dam. Language has changed the environment in which brains have evolved. That changes the picture radically, because now one can look at the brain, so to speak, an inside-out perspective of the problem, and ask the question, what's different about human brains, and how might that difference tell us something about the forces that shaped it? And if those forces include language, then the brain itself is a wonderful signature, a wonderful trace for the forces that helped it evolve, so to speak, in this complicated interaction. And so the Symbolic Species, the title, captures this notion that we are a species that in part has been shaped by symbols, in part shaped by what we do, and therefore our brain is going to be very different in some regards than other species' brains, in ways that are uniquely human.
We have a noisy something, I can't tell.
Okay.
I think it's this chair that's making this kind of knocking sound every time you move. It's a really slight, like the camera's
This one does not, as far as I can tell.
That one's not.
Let
I
me see
feel
if I
like
can...
it's
Now, it might also be the stool. I think that stool is a little creaky. I've heard you creak a few times.
I tried to get it to make noise.
Okay.
I think it was your chair.
Well, it gave it a good pause point anyway.
Okay, good.
Let's give you this one,
Yeah,
just this time.
of course. Yeah, look, mine.
Yeah, right. Took care of that. Thank you.
Yes. Work around a little bit. I don't seem to be making any noise, so
Yeah,
could it have something to do with the air conditioner that we hear humming up above?
Decoupled in a way that nothing going on in this loop can feed back to cause problems.
correct.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, there's so many things to talk about, and I'm both interested in the general work that you're doing and how I can relate that to the story that
Right.
we're trying to tell. When you mentioned the difference between the fact that you could see structures in the monkey brain that predicted or that mirrored over to what you saw in the human brain, even though obviously the human brain is doing complex things the monkey brain's not doing. It suggests some other more extended virtualized overlay that's involved rather than it being at the neuroanatomical organization level.
The change in the human brain has to be a physical change. That is, the reason that we do what we do and other species don't with respect to language is clearly something about human brains. In this regard, I think there can be no disagreement that there's something built into us, something innate that makes us language ready. And I think there's no question about that. The real question is what kind of thing? What would you have to do, or what did evolution ultimately do to make this brain language ready? There's all kinds of different ways you could look at that question. One is that it built it all in. If I was an engineer, I would find all the parts that are necessary to make language and stick it in there, stick in these new parts. The fact that we found no new parts per se suggested that that's probably not the right way to go about the question. But also there's not a clear sense in which you could look at it as something like a software addition, like we took the same old computer and put in new software, because in fact the computer, so to speak, is different. It's a really different kind of brain. So for me, taking the inside-out perspective, so to speak, looking at brains for clues to language rather than the other way around, I asked the question this way. This is probably the most significant departure from any kind of behavior that we've seen in other species. And it's radically different in many, many ways from what other species can do. Such a large-scale difference, and probably the biggest difference between us and other species, ought to be reflected in some of the biggest differences between human brains and non-human brains. So with that as a kind of guiding hypothesis, not even a hypothesis, it's a sort of a heuristic as to what to look for. I asked the question, so what's different about human brains? If one could categorize in a systematic way what is really different about human brains, wouldn't that tell you something about language? And so that's really been the guiding strategy to some extent for what I have done over the years. And what that amounts to is you first of all have to look at the big things, the obvious things. And I say big in a sort of punish sense because what's really different about human brains is, of course, they're bigger. We have always assumed that that's just some sort of general story about intelligence. The truth is we don't know much more about intelligence now than we did a century ago and what the relationship is to whole brains. We don't know really how whole brains work yet. We don't have a sort of general theory that everybody agrees upon or even is close to agreeing upon. On the other hand, this major change, if it's not just blowing the thing up larger, just adding a whole lot more to everything, if it is somehow distributed in an interesting way, that distribution of how the same parts got changed and enlarged with respect to each other might tell us something about what that difference is. And in fact, it tells me something very important, and that is when you change the size of something, you also change the relationships between the parts. We know that a small business, for example, can have one kind of organization for doing things, whereas a large business, ultimately, just simply because of its size, has to have all kinds of middle managers and different kinds of bureaucracy, and people don't get to talk to everybody. The brain is a different kind of brain because it's bigger. The connections are going to be different because it's bigger. That's going to be a clue to it as well. And so I began to look at quantitative issues, and with a developmental perspective, how changes in size might change the circuits. That is, how circuits might respond to this. And I think in that, for me, has been the biggest source of insights, the biggest source of clues. They're not answers, they're clues. That is, I think that the connections are different because the brain is bigger and because not all parts expanded at the same rate. And I think that's the first inside-out clue to what's important about this language difference. What was the change in the hardware that supported this new kind of communication and cognition?
So would you say that there was this almost morphic resonance between the evolution of language and the structures in it and the evolution of the structures in the brain, that there's this kind of resonant co-evolutionary process involved?
I think clearly there was a co-evolutionary process in which language affected brains. The issue is that language changes at a much faster rate than brains. And clearly the language we have today and the kinds of languages that are all over the world were not always the way they are. We undoubtedly passed through not maybe one stage of what you might call a proto-language, but probably many proto-languages. There's many forms of this linguistic symbolic communication system over the course of our evolution, all of them leaving somewhat of a trace.
In here, but not out there.
But not externally. That's one of the real problems, of course, in studying this, is that the only trace is in brains that are alive today. We don't see a trace in the external world. And what traces we do see in the archaeological record and so on are not necessarily useful and directly correspondent maps of what's going on inside. As we know across the world, people with equal intelligence, equally complex language can be living in radically different cultures with radically different kinds of technologies. Those that can look as the Stone Age of a million years ago, those that can look as modern as we are today sitting in this studio. The same brains can be producing all of those systems, in part because it's not all inside the head. I want to say one other thing about this correspondence between language and the brain. An engineer might look for something that maps to verbs, maps to nouns, maps to the past tense. There are various features that linguists tell us that language is broken up into. But language, of course, is broken up according to a logic that has to do with communication, has to do with symbols, has to do with the constraints we have on interacting, perhaps with speech sounds, perhaps with gesture. The logic of the brain is a very old logic and a very conserved logic. It's the logic of embryology. It's the logic of self-organization. In fact, it's the logic that's been shared with a common ancestor that goes back well before vertebrates, so that we can find hints as to the organization of the genes that develop brains in fly brains. That logic has probably not changed much. That logic is the logic of the organization of brains. So there's unlikely to be a nice, neat, direct map between what we see in the language world, external, and what we see inside brains. In fact, the map may be very, very confused and very, very different inside the brain. That is how the brain does what we see externally in language.
So the brain, on the one hand, is creating out into the world what's becoming the environment that it's adapting to.
Right.
And language is one major field that's occurring in.
Yes. So, in one sense, we should expect the brain to reflect features of language, the features that it's created. But brains, for example, in the metaphor I used was beaver dams. Beaver bodies don't necessarily reflect beaver dams. They reflect the environment that was created and the demands of that environment. Those demands are not necessarily directly represented in the environment. Beavers are aquatic. Beavers have all kinds of special adaptations for living in water. It's not easy to predict from what's produced in the world what's going to happen inside, so to speak, in the body. And I think the same we can say about this troubling and complex dynamic in which language evolution and brain evolution are working in tandem, interfering with each other, confusing each other, shaping each other. That dynamic is one that's probably not going to be easy to predict. On the other hand, there are a few real general things that we can probably say are consistent. We can say about beavers that whatever their adaptations are going to be, they're going to be aquatic adaptations. There's some general things about living in the water that you need to know. Swimming, breathing, communicating, so on and so forth. One can say that there's going to be some general things that have to go along with linguistic processing. The symbol processing problem, the automatization, that is the speeding up the automatic running of syntax and of analysis. These are things that are going to be generally there. The mnemonic problems, the short-term memory problems associated with it. And of course, simply the constraints of producing and hearing sound, or producing it visually and manually and interpreting it visually. All of those are things that we could predict. So in one sense, we can use general characters of language to make predictions. Probably it's not going to be very successful if we try to use specific characters of language to make our predictions about brains.
You can't, however, see or can you, the physical trace of cognitive boundaries in the brain?
The issue again is that the logic of how brains get built and the logic of how languages get built are different logics.
Right.
The logic of brains is this embryology logic that's very old, very conserved. The logic of language is something that's brand new in the world of evolutionary biology. It happened in one species recently, at least in evolutionary terms. And in that regard, it will be a superficial trace, a tweak, so to speak, on this general pattern. But that means that a lot of the details one would expect to find from language are not going to be mapped in any simple, obvious way onto the brain. And therefore, the kind of cognitive distinctions one might expect in language are probably not going to have easy, simple correspondence in functional functional and structural changes in the brain.
But there is a relationship. I mean, the language is stretching our cognitive boundaries.
Language clearly forces us to do something that for other species is unnatural, so to speak. And it's that unnaturalness that's probably the key story. One might want to ask, what is so different about language? Or what are the aspects of language that are so different from what other species do? To answer the question, what should that imply about how brains have adapted to deal with that?
So from a human evolution point of view, you would agree with those that basically say the development of language is the single most distinguishing attribute of human beings today.
Yeah, I do think that the development of language is the single most distinguishing attribute. Now that doesn't mean speech necessarily. It means the support system that's around language, the symbolic system. Of course, our communication is much more than linguistic. Some of it is very old also, but a lot of culture is also linguistic-like in a variety of ways. And clearly that's been around a long time. The ritual, the mythology, simply ways of doing things that are organized conventionally, symbolically. This is a hallmark of our species. And we've, in a sense, transformed and even reinterpreted much of our biology through this system. And so much of what we do, whether it's marriage, whether it's warfare, or whatever, has been transformed by this tool that's, in a sense, taken over and biased all of our interactions with the world.
Yeah, it seems to me one of the most powerful. When I try to think about it, I can barely get my head around is what it must have been like to not be verbally self-reflexive, to not be aware of myself in this mirror of words, that I have this self-talk story stream that's going on. And yet, it certainly seems that at some point, human beings weren't doing that at the level that we do now. And at some other point they were, and that's this huge threshold, regardless of where you place it in time.
Yeah, I think that there are probably many thresholds that we're talking about. And that early language-like behavior might look very different. I think clearly early language-like behavior had to involve much less vocalization because the brains that preceded us, mammal brains, are not well suited to organizing sound in precise, discrete, rapidly produced, learned sequences. This is something that mammal brains, in effect, are poorly designed to do, precisely because the system we use to produce sound is a system that normally should be running on autopilot, so that we can breathe appropriately, so that we don't choke, and so on and so forth. There's literally been a change in that circuitry to override those systems in order for language to be possible. So what was language in the past, or what corresponds to language, homologically, as they say in biology, the homologs to language might have looked somewhat very different. Not a signed language necessarily, but some very complicated combination of modalities and so on. So it makes it very hard to predict what the effects might have been and how those effects were layered upon layer to produce new kinds of languages, new kinds of brains. For me, one of the things that I think is really exciting about language is this aspect of how it reflexively changes the way we think. And I think that's one of the most amazing things about being a human being. When people talk about memory, they usually talk about sort of two kinds of memory. Episodic memory, remembering a particular thing that happened, a sort of one-off event in your past, and then something called procedural memory, and the kind of memory that's involved in skill learning. The problem with one-off learning is that there's so many one-off events. How do you find them again in your memory? The problem with procedural memory is you've got to be in the same situation. I know how to ride a bike when you put me on a bike, but if you ask me to tell you exactly which leg I put on first, how do I start out, and how do I stay up, I couldn't tell you that because it's, in a sense, it's embedded in its context. Language is unique in the following sense, that it uses a procedural memory system. Most of what I say is a skill. Most of my production of the sounds, the processing of the syntax of it, the construction of the sentence is a skill that I don't even have to think of. It's like riding a bicycle. I don't even have a clue of how I do it. On the other hand, I can use this procedural memory system because of the symbols that it contains, the meanings and the web of meanings that it has access to, that are also relatively automatic, to access this huge history of my episodes of life. So that in one sense, it's using one kind of memory to organize the other kind of memory in a way that other species won't have access to without this. The result is we can construct narratives in which we link together these millions and millions of episodes in our life, in which you can ask me what happened last month on a particular day, and if I can think through the days of the week and the things I was doing when, I can slowly zero in on exactly what that episodic memory is and maybe even relive it to some sense.
Yeah, this is a very powerful point. You mentioned before the unnaturalness of this. That at one level we could say that there was a, prior to this level of self-reflexive, volitional memory recall, there was this more organismic memory that was less about me remembering and more about reassembling me relevantly to the situation that I'm in nature. They're talking about having a verbal, self-reflexive, volitional memory access and control system these little children are picking up when they're 2 and 3 and 4 years old, and how well they pick up this thing which is, in the long view of evolution, radically unnatural to the whole of their structure. It's almost fate determining.
Clearly, it changes everything about what being a human being is. I mean, I think that, again, I use the phrase the symbolic species quite literally to argue that symbols have literally changed the kind of biological organism we are. Not just in evolution, but in day-to-day life. I think we operate fundamentally differently at a cognitive level because of this. Yet, with just a few tweaks, I mean, we're essentially African apes. Just a few tweaks away from an African ape. Just enough. Herbert Simon coined this term satisficing. It's not optimizing. It's just enough to be able to do it. And I look at us as an African ape that's been tweaked just enough to be able to do this radically unnatural kind of activity, language. Now, it turns out that if that's been going on for a long time in our evolution, then it's not so unnatural after all, because of course brains will have adapted to those demands. And this sets up an interesting problem. And it speaks to the problem of how old language is. Because if language is new, if language is only, say, 100,000 years old, or even less, 50, 60,000 year old kind of process, then we should expect that it had little effect on human brains. That whatever tweaks were used were, in a sense, clumsy kludges to make the thing work. We shouldn't expect that it's easy, that it's fluid, that it runs without difficulty. On the other hand, if language has been around for a good deal of our evolutionary past, say a few million years, or even a million years, that's adequate time for it to have structured and reshaped the brain to be better satisficed to the problem of processing and using language in real time. And similarly, language will have adapted, we will have adapted this language process to be better fit to our own constraints as we go along. The two will, in a sense, be in tandem, converging towards each other. The question one has to ask from the present time, looking back, is, are we well adapted to this? Are we really a symbolic species? Or is this just a kludge added on top of a primate brain, not well designed for this? I think the evidence for the age of this probably can be best picked out by comparing to something quite relevant to what we're discussing, and that is writing and reading. Writing and reading occurred recently. Therefore, whatever we use to do this was a kludge. That is, an engineering patchwork that just sort of barely gets by. We are not well designed to do so, and as a result, a lot of people have difficulty acquiring reading and writing. And there are many kinds of difficulty. Many people will never be able to read or write because the brain hasn't had a chance, so to speak, to keep up with this process. If language itself were like that, we should expect to find those kinds of problems with our ability to acquire language. In fact, I think the surprising feature is that not only is language incredibly complex, is it acquired rapidly in our development, even when children are quite young. Reading, of course, takes quite a while to acquire. You have to wait till your brain is matured a ways. But even more interestingly, people with significant brain damage at birth nevertheless do better at language than any other species on the earth under intense training. That suggests to us that the system has even been over-designed a little bit to be prepared with a kind of redundant system in case things go wrong. Young children with the whole left hemisphere damaged or removed at a very early age can nevertheless acquire language with half a brain, so to speak. The wrong half, for that matter. That again suggests that the system is somehow over-designed. That can only occur if there's been a long evolutionary history, I think, in which language has played a significant role, suggesting to me that at least language-like processes are not new, are not recent.
Whereas language...
Perfect place to stop.
Okay. Take in?
Okay.
Okay.
I was sweating it.
Stop in 25-ish. Well, where I was going with that last question was...
Tape here.
Was-
Settled. Great.
So we were making this distinction between the unnaturalness that's still got a natural drive in it and the clearly inventional contrivance, that we see a few thousand years ago, which is virtually nothing. And somewhere in the middle, the language system going from whatever it was, which parenthetically I want to have a conversation after this about affects, and the language of affects is one of the steps in the world of language. But that at some point we became spoken, we developed speech, which was a big kick in the development of language as we use it at some point. But that folds back on itself to become this self-reflexive awareness system, which doesn't happen. Now that seems to be the most unnatural, the least natural precedent in the development prior to through language getting to that point. That's this big threshold. Any idea in your own view when that happened? That's happening within the 100,000 year spectrum because of the anatomical aspects of the jaw and so forth?
Well, the issue of vocalization, I think, is an important one. Because when we look at the brains and the vocal tracts of non-human mammals, they're quite different than ours. for me, the vocal tract itself is a secondary feature, though it plays a role. It plays a role in the kind of sounds that we can produce and so on, the diversity and the range of phonation that we produce. That is the range of vowels mostly. But even more troublesome is the anatomy of the control of the larynx. One of the things that I and a colleague, graduate student of mine, Alan Sokoloff, pursued over a decade ago was trying to understand the connections between the forebrain and the structures of the larynx and the tongue, crucial to language. And it turns out that very likely our ancestors, the Australopithecines and of course before them, had, like other mammals, a relatively disconnected control of the larynx and even of the tongue to some extent. By that I mean that there was probably not much voluntary control over vocalization, and certainly not at the level at which you could stop and start it on a dime, so to speak, with very little affect associated with it. That changed over the course of evolution, and I think we have some clue to that because I think that there's good reason to suspect that the change in size of the brain had something to do with the change in control of that system. The secondary signal for that we actually can see in the fossil record is probably the change in the base of the cranium of the skull and its shape and what it tells us about the position of the larynx. And its role in producing sound, of course, wouldn't be selectively favored if there wasn't already a need to produce sound in an articulate way. In other words, the production of vocal speech has to, in a sense, precede and drive and co-evolve with the sound production system externally. So by the time we begin to see this, and this, as we now know, precedes human beings, precedes anatomically modern humans, going back to the time of Homo erectus and the early Homo sapiens type. We see some of these changes already occurring. That suggests that already vocalization was being used in a way different probably than other species. So in this regard too, probably speech, that is the transfer of this communicative task to sound, was probably a slow evolving, gradually improving feature. Now, why should speech take over from the arms and hands? Well, obviously your arms and hands could be used for other things. It'd be nice to free it up. On the other hand, it's also in some ways easier to mimic the sounds. One of the problems in learning language is that we have to learn the sounds of language. To learn a manual display, one has to take in the display that you see and then, so to speak, do a mirror image reversal. Because for me to do it, I have to take your perspective and do it that way. That's an extra cognitive step that makes copying true mimicry of behavior a little difficult. But many species, especially bird species, mimic sound. Because what we hear is not all that different from what we hear when we produce it as well. You don't have to go through that extra step. So there's probably that reason, among others, that are involved in why speech took over this function more and more over time. I don't think it's a case of it suddenly taking over. I think that the evidence we have suggests that it probably took over gradually. As speech becomes more and more an issue, there may well be different demands in processing time, in short-term memory, and so on and so forth, that go along with it. So as we begin to change this system, the whole system has to change around it. And again, all of this makes the study of the evolution of language somewhat more difficult than just doing a just-so story about when it might have occurred.
Relative to that,
Yeah.
the production of speech, the way that we produce speech, the degree of coordination between all these different systems that, as you said before, were at one point running on automatic, and that now needed to be conscripted by this communication system in order to allow this partially volitional drive to punctuate and articulate through this whole sound system. This this changed the shape, time, frequency, packet sizes, whatever you want to call it, of the information exchange that's going on. I would think also that speech had a benefit in that you didn't have to see it, right?
Yeah.
You could be across the tree from each other. You didn't have to look at each other and be able to see each other's gestures to be able to communicate, right? So you could coordinate at a greater distances. But relative to where our story goes ultimately, one of the things that we're talking about, of course, is that this reading thing, at least initially, as children are developing, has to overlay on top of this whole speech thing. Right? So it has to work inside the constraints. It has to assemble. Right? It has to take this code and simulate the assembly of this speech process, whether it's virtually or actually virtually heard or actually spoken. And so the timing of how all this construction stuff has to work has to fit inside of the timing constraints and structural constraints of speech. What have you discovered in that decade ago when you were doing this kind of research or subsequent that casts any light on the timing coordination of the different component parts involved in this dance called speech?
The timing is not something that I have really done direct work on, but something that's relevant to that.
Okay, good.
I think that we can learn quite a bit about the neurological problem by looking at how writing systems themselves have evolved. It's evolving, of course, in a social sense. It's in response to changes that stuck or didn't stick in these various systems. The few times that language has turned into writing, become externalized in the world, almost all begin with a kind of pictorial mode. The problem with pictures is that, of course, they're not like sound, not like language. The advantage of pictures is that they're much closer to what they represent in some sense, so that we can even look at some of these ancient writing systems and make some guesses, educated guesses. Turns out usually they're wrong for interesting reasons. And one of those reasons is that even as soon as picture-like writing came about, people began to use the pictures to also represent sounds, the name of things, a rebus, like you find in a Coke bottle cap, in which you're trying to figure out the meaning of something by using a picture to represent a sound also. Most of the pictorial writing systems very quickly took on sound iconism, that is sound likeness as well. The word for that thing has a sound, and I can use that sound element to put together with other sound elements. And so what happened very quickly, that kind of system gets co-opted. Now, in one sense, you can say, well, this is a disadvantage because the interpretation of the meaning might be easier if you could see the picture, if you got something about the picture of it right away, because vision is one of the ways we remember objects and relationships and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's broken up into bits and pieces. It's separated. And of course, it's quite distant from speech. Speech has recoded this in a whole different way. What seems to have happened in most of the world's written forms, not all of them, but even in those that are still have a bit of pictorial nature to them, even have acquired this feature. And that is that they've become representations of the speech stream itself, and only secondarily of something in the world. And what that tells us is that, in a sense, these have become adapted to us. That is, our constraints, the thing that we do well automatically, and not any longer adapted to what we do easily, but is not so flexible and facile as language, which has this kind of evolutionarily instantiated support system that makes it relatively effortless. So something that is, in a sense, more encoded than a picture is actually easier for communication in this regard. It's still a kludge. It's still an external invention for which brains weren't well designed. But I think the evolution of writing systems is a hint to what the brain design is. They're not perfect. They're also satisfice. There are also other factors that are influencing them. But they are, in a sense, evolving towards a better fit to what we do automatically and easily.
In your book, you make reference to.
Maybe take a little water.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you sound kind of.
You have to understand that I have a week typically of hour-and-a-half lectures and 3-hour lectures. And that week is now just ended.
You're right.
Uh-huh. That's right, it is Friday, isn't it?
Yes.
You probably had Monday off, though. You probably missed the lecture day.
No, it turns out my lectures are all Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, packed in. 6 hours worth of talking straight.
That sounds a little better.
Good, thanks, Renee. In your book, you make an interesting correlate that the language is actually reflecting the child
Yes.
rather than the adult. And this is something that creates quite a contrast, because I think that's not the case with writing systems. The writing systems are an invention of adults, for adults, that there hasn't been the same degree of evolutionary loop concerning itself with how well it fits the child.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about writing is how long it takes before we're mature enough, before our brain is ready to acquire it and to do it easily. Because the learning process there is clumsy. With respect to speech or even signed languages, the learning process is already set up. And from a very early age, in fact, we're able to do things that, if one was just to look at the complexity of the task, would seem infinitely more complex than interpreting these letters and figuring out how letters map to sounds. I think that that's a real, in a sense, paradox that makes the reading and writing problem stand out. But there's another feature to this in which both writing has adapted to some of the constraints of adults using it, of course, whereas speech and signing have probably adapted more to children acquiring it. And the reason I say that is that, of course, the only languages that can be passed on down effectively and efficiently are those that can be picked up quickly and easily at the youngest possible age. Why at the youngest possible age? Because if you have to use this for everything you do, to some extent you want to acquire it in a way that's most suited to your brain, in which most of your resources have been organized with respect to it. Early on, brains are quite plastic, quite flexible. The result is, the more experience with language we have very early, the better we are at it as adults. Those who have been deprived in one way or another of that experience are quite poor in their linguistic abilities as adults, some never acquiring some of the features of language. So to some extent, the very specialization that we have for acquiring language, in acquiring it at an early age, amplifies this difference in human brains. That brains come into the world, so to speak, expecting to be bombarded with language at an early age as part of its organizing principle. And that human brains that don't get that experience, in effect, are not getting the normal nutritive experience of their expected, so to speak, evolutionary anticipation of this kind of environment that they're about to fall into.
Back to where our stories head, in case there's another place that we can plug in here. And just building on the point from a moment ago, we talked about this difference between the language adapting itself to how learnable it is for young children, because that's what's selecting it, and they've grown together. That's where the coevolutionary linkage is the most powerful between humans and language. But between the writing systems, it's an adult contrivance that's on the other side of this language learning barrier. It's on the other side of this abstract self-reflexiveness. And it requires different kinds of processing than a child, than is natural to the child, even as they're going through this language acquisition. When you were talking about writing systems and the image orientation of all of the early ones, one of the things that's most amazing to me and to the work that we're trying to do on writing systems is the degree of disambiguation and assembly that has to happen to convert, these letters I don't know if you've ever looked at this, but any one letter has this field. It's almost like a quantum field of potential sounds that collapses in the context of something that must be buffered in memory that can go for many, many seconds into the future. In other words, what determines a particular letter in word 1 may be a particular letter in word 7 that actually changes that. And yet this whole dance, assembly, disambiguation, clarification has to happen fast enough between the time our eyes are scanning these letters so that the whole thing emerges in us like we're talking to ourselves.
Right.
So the way in which the brain has evolved to process language is this boundary, this container in which this other system has to artificially generate. Is there anything in the, I know you said before timing wasn't a particular area that you played around with, but in your conversation about writing systems and pictographic writing systems, have you ever encountered any comparisons in your work between these different modalities of writing and their effects or the requirements on the brain, of the brain?
The analogy that comes to mind is the analogy of the various kinds of computer operating systems that have occurred over the past few decades. One of the things that I think we oftentimes use as a model for language, and it's typically the model that many linguists take home, when you're trying to come up with a rule system to describe a natural language, it turns out to be enormously complicated. Lots of tweaks and special cases and rules that are very arcane that no one really knows themselves, but one has to discover, so to speak, as you study language. As a result, I think many people have looked at language as though it's this kind of engineered, clumsy interface that we have to acquire. And if you look at that like a computer interface written by engineers who's got to be used by non-engineers, it looks as though it's this impossible thing to learn. It takes a whole lot of work to do it. The result is it looks as though you have to have a special training to do it in advance. Before you get there, you have to have gone through the class, you have to have read the manual, and then you can figure it out, or you have to have the crib sheet in your brain to begin with. On the other hand, when we looked at the evolution, so to speak, of computer interfaces, we found very quickly that people realized that one has to change that interface so it's better suited to the users. And very quickly we see something just the opposite of the literary problem, and that is text-oriented interfaces were rapidly replaced by object-oriented, iconic interfaces. In some ways, working with things in the world, treating the computer screen and the contents of the computer as though they were physical objects we could move around, was much more natural. There is something radically unnatural, ultimately, in reading off the computer screen, figuring out, decoding what it meant, figuring out how to use other words to accomplish what you wanted the computer to accomplish, to instruct it, so to speak. Because, in fact, it required all these extra encoding and decoding steps. We made computer interfaces more natural, and they're progressively getting more and more natural so that little kids, in effect, can pick it up quite easily, where we couldn't have expected 20 years ago any child to pick up an operating system that was run with a caret and a word to start the thing out. The interesting feature of that is that, to some extent, writing is still like that early computer interface. It requires these complicated learning processes in which we learn the sounds first, we learn the words, we eventually learn to make these complicated decodings. We probably automate a lot of it so that we actually don't even see the letters much anymore as we read through it. This is why when I look at my own writing, I oftentimes don't catch my own typos. Because I've automatically begun to just sort of see things as whole words, or in fact even whole phrases. I look past them, they're so easy for me. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that for those who haven't gone through that process, who haven't read the manual, so to speak, haven't memorized the operating system to begin with. It's an enormous task just to get started, just to go to square one to be able to use the machine, so to speak, in this case, reading and writing. So I think what hasn't happened is that system has not evolved to the level that it becomes natural, spontaneous in the way that, for example, computer interfaces have. Does that mean we will ever come up with a writing system that does that? Maybe not. Because, in fact, to represent sound is not a trivial matter. We don't represent sound in the icons on a computer screen precisely for that reason. It's so complicated, it takes a lot of decoding.
You're mentioning...
Dave, excuse me. Just so that you know, in the background, you might occasionally hear this.
Oh.
You're actually, I can hear it. So
Very good. I'll try not to do it.
just to let you know.
I'm often amazed when computer engineers try to dissect some aspect of human behavior as if it could be an engineering feat. But it seems so absurd on so many levels, language being one of them. I mean, the idea that a center fielder could hear the crack of a bat and run to some place deep in center field and catch it over their head without looking back is, I mean, there's no machine in the world that could figure out how to do that or coordinate all that would be necessary from that sound, that acoustical signature in that way. So there's a lot of things that human beings do that defy all of our sense of being able to break it down and put it into some kind of an engineer's logic of how it might be reproducible.
One of the things I wanted to say about that, I think it's interesting that in the history of recent linguistics, we have modeled language processing on a Turing machine. The original generative grammar that Noam Chomsky pioneered made a radical advance in the field with, is modeled on the way computers work. That is, a simple set of instructions and rules to generate something. Almost certainly, that's radically different than the way brains work. The question is, can we use that descriptive tool, that engineering model, to go back and try to figure out how brains are doing this? Or, in fact, does that engineering model actually get in the way of figuring out what the brain's logic is, as opposed to a Turing machine logic?
Well, that depends on whether it's an exploratory observational lens or whether we're taking it as the frame that to see reality through, right?
Right.
I mean, it's how we approach that. Back to the writing systems. What's so amazing to me that I'm trying to get out in the series is the challenge, the neurological challenge, because it's so time precarious.
Right.
I mean, the amount and complexity of ambiguity. As you said, okay, you're reading, I do have the same experience. I'm reading along something I've written. My mind's priming as I see a letter. I'm guessing the rest of it. It's revealing certain strategies about how we construct things.
Right.
It's available to all of us that look. And if those guessing strategies misform early, it creates havoc because it's very difficult to get back to them, to reform them.
I think the crucial problem with all of language as we use it today is the problem of automatization. How do we take something that has so many variables, so many possible connections and combinatorial options, and do it without having to think about it? How do we turn this complicated set of relationships into a skill, ultimately, that can be run, in effect, as though it was a computation? The key is that, of course, what we're really doing is we're taking something that is a nightmare for computation, and yet we have to turn it into, as we mature, both as language users but also as readers and writers, we have to automatize it so that we don't have to think about those details. The problem with automatization is that at any step, if you've got a slowdown step, if any piece of that enterprise has a block, or you can't hold enough of the information, the whole house of cards falls apart. You can't build beyond that point. It looks as though with the acquisition of language itself, speech particularly, that we've got a lot of redundancy in the system. We have workarounds that are there probably evolved there because it was so important and because there was enough evolutionary time behind that process to build in that safety net, so to speak. With respect to reading and writing, there was no evolutionary support. With respect to reading and writing, there is no safety net. There are probably very few redundant workarounds that are successful, that don't take longer, that aren't more clumsy, aren't so clumsy that they drop something, they don't keep track of it, or they're simply too slow to keep up with your memory process.
Right. We stutter.
Right.
It's a stutter that happens. And when the stutter happens during this assembly, you get this start-stop hesitation that after a while creates this frustration and then reading aversion and all that can go with it.
Right.
4 minutes. Okay.
Let's use this as a stop point for one more thing.
Okay.
Okay. And then we have one more.
Fine. And I think externalization of thoughts and externalization of language particularly is not a trivial task. So the question that I often ask people, well, if language is such a powerful thing, and we were able to externalize these symbols in art forms on cave walls, why did it take so long to externalize language itself? Why didn't we learn to read and write until only a few thousand years ago? Why didn't we invent that way back when, right after this big explosion? It's because I think externalizing language is not just a cognitive problem. It's a social problem. I think externalizing symbols in general, whether it's paintings on walls, is a social issue. Certain contexts in the social, cultural realm have to be there to support it. Languages don't show up written in most societies in the world. They show up in a few places. There are places where there's cities, where there are governments, where there's trade, where there's concentrations of people. That is, there is a social evolutionary support behind the development of writing that was required before it could be externalized, before you could put it outside of the body, so to speak, and so people could use it. I think the same is true probably of this event 60,000 years ago. That what we're seeing is an externalization event. Externalization depends upon a social basis, a culture already being established, some supports that make it useful, that make it worth doing, so that it accomplishes something. For reasons that I don't understand yet, that support wasn't there. I don't think it was that the brain wasn't ready for it, any more than the brain wasn't ready to produce writing 60,000 years ago. The brain was ready to produce writing as well as it was today, because we essentially have the same brain. It had to wait for something else, because it's an emergent phenomenon. It's not just the playing out of something that was in the head. In both cases, the production of artwork on the walls of caves and the carvings of bone, and the production of externalized symbols in the form of speech requires more than just something in the brain. It requires a complex social milieu to support it and make it worthwhile.
This is very analogous or on the spectrum with embryology.
Yes.
In the sense that what we're talking about here is there's this injection back and forth process going on, almost at another level. When I think about this, it's almost like there's this parabolic inversion from this whole to one in the way that these two systems work.
Yes, right.
That the outside, that language itself is a property of a collective, not an individual.
Right.
I'm not so sure that affects aren't at another level of conversation.
I think you're right.
Right? That these are properties not of an individual organism that you could pull out of the context of a group or family or tribe or society or culture, however you want to cut it. But it's not a property of an abstract individual. It's a property of a collective.
And I think we have a real difficulty conceiving of causality in systems. We want to find the cause in a single thing. We want to reduce the cause to an invention in history, a famous man who makes something happen, to a discovery, or to a single gene that makes it happen, or some biological accident that makes it happen. We have a real difficulty when cause is distributed, when the cause is in many places at once, in which the consequence is the result of a convergence of these influences, no one of which is the cause. And language, of course, is exactly that kind of a situation. Language is a case in which it doesn't make sense for an individual to have a language. A unique individual language is a non sequitur, a non-starter. It's something that is systemic from the beginning. In the same sense, what we've learned about, of course, evolution and what we've learned about embryological development is they are also systemic. They're not instructed from single genes that say, you must be this shape. They're the result of the genes setting in motion competitions, growth processes, interactions, communications, and out of those relationships emerge the structures that we see in embryos. Similarly, in ecosystems, out of the relationships of ecosystems come the various niches in organism designs.
This is precisely how I define learning. That I like to look at learning as this process that we're describing now, rather than this singular process that it's often thought to be. In that, like you're saying, rather than there being, or the Chomsky argument, or the other arguments that this structure exists in here, right? That this corresponds to this structure in here, rather than we are unfolding and differentiating and extending ourselves, and all of which is another word for learning if you move into a different alignment about that word. So we're unfolding into differentiation that's creating a more differentiated, more complex social environment, which is then creating the context that we're unfolding in, and that this is this very complex, rich, non-linear, causal, isolated event kind of thing.
Well, even when we learn individual words, we don't, as a sort of caricature would suggest, we don't hear the word, ask somebody what it means, and know automatically how to use it. We do sometimes ask people what things mean, but usually we learn words in context. We learn what words mean by progressively differentiating their meaning, by catching the nuance, the connotation, the way they fit with things. And we know when somebody doesn't quite understand the meaning of a word, especially a technical word, because they oftentimes use it in a sort of rote way that's out of context, in which it misses some crucial connections because they haven't, in fact, differentiated it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that myself. Let me check my notes here. Tell the story just because I thought it was so beautiful in the book, and I think I want to include it because it hits on children and language and all the rest of it, that you started with in the book about your years of experience in this field and it being stumped by the 8-year-old.
Oh. Well, really what prompted me to write the book, and prompted a lot of my thinking, was not the readings of experts in the field, but in fact an encounter with an 8-year-old. And in one of my son's classes, I went in as a dad, telling the classroom what Dad does for a living, give kids an idea of different occupations and that sort of thing. And I, of course, talked about my studies of the brain, my interest in language, and so on. And in that process, I said the standard things, such as that, language is a unique form of communication that only humans do, and we must have a lot of changes in our brain that make it possible, that we're specialized for this purpose, and that we're the only species that does this. And of course, this prompted a young kid to say, well, but don't dogs and cats have language, dog language and cat language and bird language and so on? And I said, well, metaphorically, yes, they communicate, but their way of communicating is very different than ours. And I went on to explain those differences. That didn't seem to satisfy this questioner, who came back again and said, okay, I get it. So they have simple languages and we have complicated languages. And I thought for a second, and I said, no, it's not like that. It's not that they're simple languages. They're very different than language. There aren't things like verbs and nouns and so on and so forth. Language is really quite different, and the way it combines things is quite different. So it's not really simple and complicated. For some reason, that was a real troubling answer as well. And the question that came back to me was, why? Why don't animals have simple languages? Well, I managed to get myself out of that question by sort of confabulating the way an adult does and says, well, of course, we don't understand all those things, and very complicated question, and moving on. But that question, why, really bothered me. It bothered me for a simple reason, and that is that all of the explanations that we had cooked up for this didn't seem to answer that stupid, simple question. Because if language was just very complicated and you needed a really good brain with lots of learning devices to acquire it, then animals ought to have simple languages. But in fact, they have something very different than language. It's a whole lot more like laughter and sobbing and smiles and frowns and so on, which we also have. A simple language also wouldn't require you to have a kind of crib sheet in your brain, a language device, a universal grammar that allowed you just to say, oh, it's one of those, I got that already. Because a simple language, you wouldn't need all of that support because you wouldn't have to worry about it. There wasn't in the standard explanations of intelligence, of special language devices, and so on and so forth, any story that answered the reverse question, not why we have language, but why aren't there simple languages out there? Why don't animals just slightly less intelligent than us have just a slightly simpler language? And those less intelligent than them have a slightly simpler language than that? Or why aren't there dozens of languages with different language devices in different species that are all like language but very, very different and not intertranslatable? We don't find something like that. That suggested to me that we were on the wrong track.
Whatever the pre-spoken language forms were of communication and things involved in, we've already talked about the fact that they're a reflection of the cultural pressure of a collective human being, people being together in some way that their collective behaviors were more complex to give rise to the selective pressure towards this communication, towards language, in a way that other species don't. I mean, are there other species that get together in group sizes and do complex things that could have promoted language in a way that has human beings?
Well, of course, there are many social insects that are in very large groups, and they do have complicated communication. It's typically one-off communications. That is, they have particular odors, particular sounds perhaps that they produce to organize themselves. And then, of course, responses, instinctual responses when they encounter a movement, a sound, an odor from some other individual to produce their behavior. You get very complex social organizations. One might say, well, don't look at those creatures. They have very small brains. Of course, they're doing it differently. They're more like little tiny computers solving this problem. We do have animal groups, mammal groups, bird groups that can actually be in fairly large numbers interacting. Birds that have to nest in limiting areas, large herd animals that work together, large schools of fish that seem to coordinate their activities, as in flocks of birds that control their activities in the numbers of 100. It's not unusual to find large groups of social species carefully integrated in their interaction. So for me, the size of the social group is not necessarily a telling feature. I think that there is a kind of minimal size of social group necessary to produce the kinds of pressures to generate language.
Necessary but insufficient.
That's right.
So then we move to what do you think were the cultural pressures beyond a certain minimal and necessary but insufficient thereafter size that would have promoted language?
Well, I think we can talk about you might say the minimal size to produce language in the same way we would talk about the minimal conditions to produce writing in human societies. I think there are similar kinds of problems. What has to happen to produce writing, as far as we can tell by looking at those examples that we've seen, are that writing emerges in complex societies with dense populations, with what amount to city-like organization, in which large numbers of people have to be organized and controlled. Oftentimes trade seems to be involved in this.
My understanding is that primarily all the earliest artifacts we have are all trade-related.
Trade-related. Although in the Central America, it may not be quite so simple as that. It may be more around religious communication and ritual organization. But it could well also be paying of something like taxes, tithes, and so on and so forth.
Right, the wampums and what have you are different.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but in any case, what we see there is not just a number of people, but in a sense, certain communicative demands that show up with numbers, with the coordination problem of exchanging things and keeping things organized, and particularly maintaining the differentiation of roles in that population. So I think when we go back to look at the origins of the first symbolic communication, and by this I mean something well before what we would recognize as language, but communicating things in the abstract, communicating things that are, in a sense, not necessarily in the here and now, but naming and discussing things, representing things that might be or were or could have been. In that process, one needs a social organization that's already creating that need. In some sense, the social organization must have been moving in that direction.
But was there an abstract sense of the not now before there was language to mediate it?
I think there was not necessarily a sense of the not now. And the question is, do you invent words to represent something you're thinking, or do the words help you think things that you couldn't have thought before you had them?
You look at the optimal path for children learning words, and with my experience and observation, is to get the word at the very reaching edge of a differentiation or a distinction that's being made that the word can now act as a label for.
Right. And I think the acquisition of language, as well as its early evolution, has this same dynamic. It's again a kind of a co-evolutionary dynamic in which the context is demanding it, in which the support is nearly there to produce it, in which, in a sense, the inside and the outside are both ready for a convergence on this result. The question about the origins of language really is, what unusual social context becomes the support for creating a kind of communication that is a non sequitur in evolution, that was not there before. Of course, whenever we do this, we've moved into storytelling. We've moved into just so stories, to what I call scenarios. I don't think scenarios are science, but I also don't think that you can do science without a little bit of storytelling just to shoehorn your thinking in that direction, and to do what Dan Dennett calls these kinds of things intuition pumps. And I like that concept. So I think that our storytelling is useful. I think it probably will never tell us what actually happened, because a story is not how evolution works. It's not a narrative. It's a statistical process. Nevertheless,
There's a space for us that we wouldn't have opened otherwise. This is Einstein's imagination is more important than knowledge.
That's right. Exactly. And so for me, what I try to look at in human evolution is what unique social context is there in our ancestors. Not what need they have to make tools, not what need they have to hunt necessarily. These are things that other species can do, and other species do in combination with each other. I think some of the interesting demands are probably having to do with the way we organize ourselves reproductively. And my argument in the Symbolic Species focuses on this for a couple of reasons. And again, it's a scenario. It's my guess as to what social features drive this. The scenario suggests that we look at other species for where the most elaborated communication tends to occur in a social group. What context does it occur around? We don't have to look far in the vertebrate world to see that it's almost always about reproduction. It's about who mates with whom, and who is in control or constraining that mating process. And finally, who is obligated to whose offspring, and so on. Those are very crucial issues that, of course, occupy most soap operas still today.
The nuances of sexual politics.
The nuances of sexual politics. So for me, that was the place I thought one should look to find out what was the social cauldron in which the conditions began to generate. For me, the issue begins to make sense when you think about a shift into using meat. I don't necessarily mean hunting. This could be just scavenging for meat. What happens is a number of serious problems. I think it's the first real serious division of labor problem, because females with young infants are not wise to be sitting out on a kill site on the open savanna. That's a place where you want to keep your young infants who are making noise and fussing and tending to run away in hiding, because there's going to be other scavengers and predators at the same place. There's going to need to be some kind of cooperation around that, which means that males are going to have to be in some sort of agreement with each other, because they're defending each other in this kill site in order to get the meat. If it's just long enough to be able to cut off a leg or something from this downed animal and run up a tree with it, where no other animals can chase you for the moment. But that sets up a whole series of reproductive problems, I think, that didn't occur before that. And
At the core of that point is there's some realization that we're better off cooperating.
that cooperation is crucial. In other words, the story of language has to be, I don't think, competition, social competition, like we see in other species. Though many people have suggested that, of course, we use language a lot to do Machiavellian kinds of analyses and to trick each other and to take advantage of each other. No question that's true. Is that the environment that would have generated the evolution of language? That is, a means of communication that depends upon social agreement. It seems to me unlikely. It doesn't seem to me that that means it can't be used for that. In fact, almost certainly everything we have gets used for our competition. So the social problem that I see that derives from this is you've got this difficult issue of needing to cooperate while sexually you're competing. Animals in groups are always in sexual competition with each other. Who gets to mate with whom is a crucial problem when you're in a social group. And the closer and the tighter that social group, the more individuals that have to be superimposed together, the more difficult negotiating that becomes.
And negotiating is where the language comes in to differentiate to a point where you can cooperate.
So the problem of negotiation, especially in a group that has to cooperate, is that you have to find ways of representing the what if. It's not that you thought the what if necessarily, but there are alternatives that aren't there now. What if I'm not here? Will this change the mating strategy? What if I'm off at the kill site and there's other males back here? Can I rely on females to avoid? Can I rely on that male to respect the fact that I'm the dominant animal? I'm not there to defend my mating access. Will that change things? What can I rely on? I think what we can rely on and what we still rely on is what amounts to the gossip and the tattletale side of things. That is, we use other eyes who know that there are agreements, that we have expectations, and that we have come to some sort of agreement to keep things on the up and up, keep things even, so to speak, so that we can both cooperate and compete in some sort of a balance that doesn't tear the group apart. I think that's spontaneously generated by this context of moving into the meat niche. And I think that has to be negotiated by finding ways of externally representing the the what if. So it's, in a sense, it's like a social contract story. It's not about marriage per se. It's simply about negotiating this complicated cooperation-competition balance.
One level in this, that's great. I really like that piece. One level in all of this that seems obvious but not generally perceived is that what makes humans so powerful is our ability to learn together. Right? It's not only do we individually learn in ways that are off the scale of other creatures, but we collectively learn. We can learn to collaborate. We can learn to do things together, and that our civilization, everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, all are connected to this.
Yeah.
And so what you're describing is both the drive underneath.
Sorry, I was just getting sort of a